You're watching Captains of Industry here on CNBC Africa. I'm chatting to Riaan Jonck, who is the Managing Director of Pearson South Africa. Riaan, thanks very much for your time. Big debate point at the World Economic Forum on Africa here in Cape Town is the state of education in Africa. Do you believe there is a silver bullet to leapfrog the education environment in the short term?
I think, Bronwyn, a good debate to have. I think it's right for the world to have this debate, especially in Cape Town, the World Economic Forum now. I think the answer is a long-term answer. There are many things that are influencing the education system. It's technology, it's teachers, it's infrastructure, and a short-term answer isn't necessarily the right one. Although we may be able to treat the symptoms, I think in the long term we've got to treat those deeper issues, and using technology and making sure that teachers can use them is a longer-term solution.
Looking at the digital revolution and how we are seeing disruptive technologies like Uber transforming industries, do you think that we're waiting for some technical innovation that can transform education?
It's a very good question. We've sponsored something called Edupreneurs, which is entrepreneurs but for education people, and what we wanted to do was get exactly that out of them. So we sponsored people saying, bring us what ways that you can see the education sector can benefit from using technology and software to enhance education in Africa. So leapfrog the traditional system and go to something that's far more acceptable and easier to implement in Africa. So we've sponsored that, and I think that's absolutely right. What we've got to do is encourage these people and encourage bigger companies to start changing the boundaries and not wait for the silver bullet to happen. It's not going to happen, and the younger, smaller, more agile companies will start doing that.
So this is a phenomenon that we deal with on a regular basis, and that is the disparity between public and private sector across many different sectors within the economy, whether it is health, infrastructure, education. On the education front, how do we close that gap, bring public and private closer to some indication that we all batting on the same side?
I think the one thing that you've said is the word partnership. I think there's got to be a very strong partnership between industry and government in order to fix that. If you look at the common factors of success, or one of the biggest common factors of success, is the strong relationship between government and whatever sector that is, whether that be education or medical or whatever. I think that's the first instance, and I think between publics and privates, there's got to be a little bit of a balance. In order to get a balanced view, you've got to have the left and the right views, and that brings you to a balanced viewpoint. And I'm not proposing for a second that education should be taken over by privates, but I think what the private industry can do is it moves a lot faster. It can work on models at low cost to understand what the success factors are in a low-cost education system, and it can show government these are the principles that this model work on, and you can implement that. In fact, what you can come up with is an education system that spends less but gets better outcomes.
Now let's talk about the National Education Collaboration Trust as a prime example of what multi-stakeholder relationships can achieve, specifically in the education space. Do you think that is the formula to deploy going forward?
I think it is. It's part of the answer, but I don't think it's the only answer. So in itself, as a body, I think they do very good work, but they cannot. It's impossible for them to engage every single stakeholder across all industries and across the education spectrum. So you've got to have multiple bodies of the same. And in fact, if you leave it to be a more organic relationship, I think there'll be more spontaneous solutions to some of the challenges that we have in the education sector today.
Let's come back to technology and the mobile phone penetration across the African continent, sitting at around 80%. Can we use mobile phones as a vehicle, or is it much more complex than I'm assuming?
I think for a start, putting education on technology and handing it over to a child and expecting the child to learn, there'll be limits to that. There'll be limitations to their ability to learn. I think in South Africa we've got infrastructure issues. In Africa you've got the same. You've got bandwidth problems. So channeling through that, through the mobile system, channeling rich content will be very, very difficult in the near term. but that doesn't mean that we can't move the mountain one shovel at a time. So at some point we've got to start doing that, and I think we've got the opportunity. I was referencing earlier in a conversation that some African countries, we leapfrogged from having no landlines, so no forms of communication other than verbal or face-to-face, to mobile. So it jumped, it leapfrogged. It wasn't. There was no telephone lines, no POTS, the old POTS lines, and I think education's got the ability to do exactly the same, but with the use of technology, no doubt.
How are we going to attract foreign direct investment directly into the education space? Because at the end of the day, investors want to put their money into a territory, achieve a return, and be able to extract their money at the end of the day with a healthy profit. Absolutely.
And as Pearson, as an investor in South Africa and Africa, we run a business to make profits. We've got shareholders, but I think it needs to be a win-win relationship. And the fact that you empower local people to execute that strategy, that business strategy, you give them the skill to actually do that on your behalf, as opposed to importing the skill into your country. That's one piece of the puzzle. And we've got to be very careful, because education is an enormously emotive subject. So if you open the doors for all sorts of educators to come into South Africa and teach whatever they want without it being regulated and without government seeing the benefit between what the private education sector or this external education partner and our local government can, if they can't see the value of that relationship, then it won't happen. And I think that the approach should be to come to government and say, this is what we'd like to do. We want to invest in infrastructure. We will impart knowledge on local skills, and therefore we'll enhance the economy of your country by teaching skill.
What about the fundamental value system when it comes to education in Africa and perhaps in other territories in the world, where the status of teachers is no longer celebrated?
I think that is something that it's a socio-economic problem, in that teachers are not respected in many ways. I don't think always they are paid the best salaries. I think the fact that we've taken the teaching system or the teacher colleges away, people are not necessarily trained how to be effective teachers. They are being taught education, but how to be an effective teacher is a different skill to have. But ultimately, it's the responsibility of society to accept teachers and government to promote that a teacher, the profession of being a teacher is a noble profession. And I believe that the people that are sitting in the teaching profession today are there for a reason. I don't think they are there to just earn money. So we've got to just get some momentum, some inertia going, and as soon as that gets going, teachers will be respected.
Are we starting to see traction on the ground in terms of elevating the status of teachers? Because this is really about a value system within the family unit, isn't it?
I think certainly not that I can see at this minute. I think
we need to do a lot more.
I think there needs to be there's a big job. It's a big task ahead of us, but we need to tackle that. We need to actually tackle that head on.
Another very valuable point that you made earlier, Riaan, was the fact that many children are being penalized for the sins of their parents, and potentially they're not even sins. When the adult gets into financial difficulty and the credit record isn't in check, then they cannot raise finance to send their child or children to school. And that's a very vicious cycle to get into. We need innovative financing solutions.
Absolutely. I think that's where industry can start taking their CSI investment, putting it in one fund, making sure that people have access to the fund on a different basis than just a credit reference, but affordability basis or a bursary scheme basis of some sort. And if corporate South Africa say, we all put our money into one fund, similar to NSFAS in South Africa, the National Student Fund, I think that could provide a model where the students can have access without their parents being burdened with, one, the loan, but two, the credit record that reflects badly on the parent has an impact on the child.
Let's talk a bit about leadership within the education space. Do we have the right leaders to solve our problems?
I think we've had the one thing that we have that is definitely counting in our favour is consistency. So the Minister of Education, of Basic Education, she's had multiple terms. We've got a system, we've got an education system that's in place where we can channel whatever we like through that channel. So that I think that the national system, the system is a successful system. It doesn't have successful results yet, but the system itself is a successful system. There are other people. I'm referencing MEC Panyaza Lesufi that's moving towards talking about paperless, the paperless classroom, and that by definition, as I said earlier, won't necessarily make the classroom more successful, but it gives you other capabilities. And he's moving the mountain one shovel at a time. And people are, as you've seen in the press, people have various opinions on that. But I think someone like him, and there are many alike, that are pushing the envelope, that needs to happen more regularly and harder than it's happening at the moment.
Let's bring it home to Pearson and talk about the challenges that you're facing in setting up a business across Africa.
So infrastructure, I think, is probably one of our biggest issues. I think if you think about just something very simple, if the load shedding in South Africa, if it's not common to South Africa, it happens in other parts of Africa as well. In some instances, you have tables of when the power will be on, as opposed to tables of when the power will be off. That's a challenge. The challenge of actually getting a mobile phone or the bandwidth to the learner, I think that's an enormous challenge. But I think a stumbling block that we've got to be very mindful of is we've got a society that loves payoffs, if you like. So
you're talking about corruption.
Full stop. and I think we need to make sure that we attack that, because if we don't, a lot of the funds that are going into the investment in infrastructure, education, etc., gets channeled to somewhere where it doesn't actually benefit what it's supposed to benefit, and that is a structural problem.
Do you think that is the most significant barrier to doing business in Africa? And I'm going to quote from Transparency International's report, where they highlight the 10 most corrupt countries in the world. 5 of them are in Africa. Is that our biggest challenge, corruption?
So half of them are in Africa, but that doesn't. Africa is a big continent compared to the rest of the world, so it's a bit of an unfair comparison to draw. But I would say that it's one of the big challenges. It's not the only challenge, but it's one of the big challenges. I wouldn't even say it's the biggest challenge. We need to be cognizant of that, and we need to understand that if 10% or 20% of it gets taken off the top, the rest that flows down to where it's supposed to make a difference doesn't make a difference. And I think if you've got political willpower to stop that, it will stop.
Another barrier that many refer to is red tape, and differing red tape within different countries. We've got 54 countries on the African continent. Do you find that those are issues that you're dealing with or grappling with on a daily basis as you try and expand into the continent? That
is probably the biggest, if we look at all the hurdles, that is probably the biggest hurdle or the highest hurdle in Africa, I think, and rightly so. Sometimes what happens is you get, there are no particular legislation on a subject or in a particular industry, and people come in and it's a boom of everyone getting in for all the wrong reasons, and then government clamps down and they say, or clamp down and they say, you cannot do this, you've got to apply the following rules, and that's red tape, effectively. So that happens a lot, and that red tape causes us and other stakeholders and other educators to go into Africa and be almost handcuffed by the red tape from time to time.
Regionalisation is another theme that I do believe is starting to gain traction on the continent. And I look now at the East African community, which by all accounts is leading the charge. We're sitting with Kenya with a population of 45 million people. We've got Uganda with a population of 40 million people. Rwanda, 12 million people. Tanzania at 55 million people. Now, if you look at each of those opportunities as an individual country, they pale in comparison to adding that all together and saying, as an East African community, I've got access to 146 million consumers across those countries. Is that a reality for you? Are you starting to look at the continent regionally?
The whole world is. I think the world looking at not a country per se, but a region, and saying, if we establish a hub there, we can scale across that area, we can scale our business across that area, and we've got access, as you pointed out, to 150 million plus people, and the buying power of those people is X, and therefore we can build our business and that sort of growth rates that they can predict. So the answer is every single business, if they're not looking at the minute. In fact, there are other countries looking at exactly the same. So China and probably India and countries that are expanding into Africa look at it in exactly the same way. You have a presence and you service that entire region with that presence.
As an international company operating on the continent, you've mentioned the power outages and the impact that is having on your business. We're sitting with a 1.3% growth rate for the first quarter annualized GDP in South Africa. The African Development Bank is forecasting that Africa will grow at 4.5% for 2015 and at 5% for 2016. Clearly, South Africa is the drag to that Africa growth story. Does it concern you that you are headquartered in South Africa? Could the constraints at any stage become too onerous and cause you to relocate?
It's possible. It's highly improbable. If I look at South Africa and compare them against many of the other African countries, and no disrespect to them, I think Cape Town is a wonderful place to live by most people's account. So we are unlikely to move our head office from here under current conditions. But I think should it change to a point where there's too many red tape, or maybe the rand falls to a point where the risk for us as a business is too big, we may consider moving to another African country. But as I said,
it hasn't been tabled to this point.
The probability is very low at this point.
The rand is hurting you at the moment?
It is. We've got foreign shareholders. We're listed on the stock exchange in London and New York, and the rand's depreciated enormously over the last 24 months.
What becomes unbearable? I mean, right now we're looking at 12 to the US dollar. What becomes unbearable for you as a company listed in as you say, in London and in New York?
I think it's a difficult answer to give you because it's a moving target. I think it's relative to the growth in the country. So when the growth starts staggering, and you've got the rand that appreciates a lot, then you've got a very, very interesting combination. The business isn't growing, so therefore net your business isn't growing because of the depreciation.
It's like running on a treadmill.
That's right, absolutely. There are means of reducing that risk, but taking out foreign currency insurance or risk, buying futures, but I think at this point it's not at the levels. It is a concern, but it's not at the levels where it's becoming unpalatable.
Your leadership style, as you grow Pearson in the South Africa fold and into Africa, what and who are you surrounding yourselves? Well, not what, but what type of person do you surround yourself with?
I think first and foremost, I'm a great believer in making sure that South African people, South African black people, has a place in our business, and we go actively out to recruit good South African black people, as we do any other people, but we need to make sure that those diamonds we hold onto and we invest in them a lot. So I'm surrounding myself with people that are local, and I support that. I think secondly, people need to, when you manage other people, when you lead other people, you need to give them a playpen to play in, a sandbox. So there's got to be some rules, but within those rules, you've got to give them the ability to use their own initiative. And as soon as you start taking that ability away, it's an institutional ability that you take away. So we very much encourage people to bring their own initiative to the table. We consider the initiative. We never stop people from asking questions. So if you've got a question to me or in a meeting, a town hall where I talk to some of the staff, I encourage people to ask questions, because the knowledge isn't just in the leadership of the business; it's everywhere in the business. And there's a book called The Humble Inquiry. If you look at the principle of that, it says every little person in the business, everyone knows something about the business, and that institutional knowledge you've got to harness to the best of your ability.
Your vision for Pearson?
I'd love Pearson to be the trusted education provider and partner in South Africa for government. So be the leader in terms of thinking outside of the box, thinking different models, helping government to solve some of the challenges that there are by employing solutions that they wouldn't have normally thought of. So a thought leader in that space, and I think it would be good for us to know that government will come to us, and we don't ask them to necessarily employ our services, but ask for our opinions. We're trading in over 70 countries in the world. We've got more than 40,000 people working for us. We know there are conditions very, very dire and worse than South Africa. And we've learned a lot of lessons from there, and we can help the South Africans.
You use a very important word, trust. And one of, again, the hot debate topics is the lack of trust between business, government, labor, and civil society. So as you say, you would like Pearson to become the trusted education advisor, effectively, to government. How do we bridge that mistrust between the two players?
I mentioned it earlier. If you do not have a good relationship between industry, whether that be education or other, between government and that industry, you will never solve the problem, because it will always be the bashing of egos of two institutions, if you like. So we really go out of our way to speak to politicians, to make them understand what we stand for, because very often we want exactly the same. We want exactly the same thing. And it's my responsibility to go out to them and say, this is what we stand for. And although we are there to make money, we have shareholders, we've got to perform, I want a win-win situation. So if I can give you something at a good rate that's more efficient than your existing, that will result in you.
How is the South African government responding to your advances?
Fairly good. No, not always. I think we've had conversations with MECs, with premiers in the different provinces. Some of them welcome us open arms, and others are a little bit more reserved, as people are. So, but the advice that we give and the opinions that we give, they listen to, and very often they come back to us and ask for more, which is a testament to maybe the advice that they've had before.
How does the Cape differ from Gauteng when it comes to government engagement? I don't want to get you into any political hot water here, but you've got two different operating systems.
No doubt. Yeah, I'm venturing into a political conversation here, but I think they can learn from each other. I think the Western Cape's doing good things, and the rest of the country, Gauteng specifically, are doing really good things. And I think we need to just get them to talk, and once they do, and in fact I think that is, in some instances, that has started to happen. And if they learn from each other, I think it'll be a good symbiotic relationship between the Western Cape and the rest of the country.
I'm going to ask you this question now in terms of what you've given us a little insight into the vision that you are wanting for Pearson, specifically within the South Africa and the Africa context. Riaan Jonck, your legacy, what do you want that to be?
I think Pearson is not a company with a big ego. So if Riaan Jonck can stand in the shadow of government and help solve some of the education problems, I wouldn't even want the world or the South Africans to know that. I think if the people that are in government, in power today, know that we've helped as Pearson, as Riaan Jonck, help solve some of the challenges that they've got, that would be a legacy enough for me. And
you acknowledge that it's going to be a long-time journey, a long-term commitment?
It has to be. Education, to solve the education problem you were asking it earlier, there's no silver bullet. It's a long slog, and I've got to make sure that I've got colleagues and a team that is ready to take on that challenge that I've given them. And yeah, we are here for the long slog.
Riaan, thank you so much for your time. I've been chatting to Riaan Jonck, who is the Managing Director of Pearson South Africa, coming to you from the 25th World Economic Forum on Africa here in Cape Town.